Chapter 23. Duncan walked through the dark camp. They had eaten their supper and been sent to bed. The 6 boys had waited for 3 hours, biding their time to make sure that the goblins were asleep and the camp was settled. They had found out that the goblins here assigned boys to stand guard at their tents through the night. Sam hadn't been concerned and had suggested that they simply approach those boys in the night and tell them that they were to go to bed, as the new boys had been assigned guard duty in their place. That was exactly what they were on their way to do at that moment. They had agreed to work in pairs, 2 of them assigned to each tent and the goblin within. They would take over the guarding of the 3 tents, wait a while until the relieved guards were back in their tents and asleep. Then, all at the same instant, they would enter the tents, gag the goblins so that they couldn't give any orders, and tie them up. The 6 of them approached the tents, at the centre of the camp. The boys currently on guard all turned their watchful stares in their direction, but none looked alarmed. Duncan and his companions split into their pairs, with Charlie accompanying Duncan. Whispering to the guards, nervous of waking the goblins, Duncan told the 2 boys, "We were ordered to take over the watch tonight. You 2 can go to your blankets and get some sleep." He was relieved that the words had come out, for he had an anxious lump in his throat at the thought that the tiniest slip could mean that it all went wrong, that they might be discovered while surrounded by the enemy. One of the boys raised a quizzical eyebrow, perhaps surprised at the unexpected change. The other boy gave a big smile, joyful at the thought of extra sleep. That idea quickly spread to the more suspicious boy, and they had no reason to believe that Duncan might be lying, so without a word they trotted off. Duncan took up his station and looked around, soon seeing 2 more pairs of boys quietly moving away from the tents. He slowly let out a relieved breath, thankful that the plan was working so far. For the next hour, the 6 boys stood in silence, waiting for everyone else in the camp to be sound asleep, occasionally shifting weight from one numb foot to the other. Eventually, Duncan was content that they were ready. As agreed, he raised one arm, quickly followed by Charlie, and then the other 4 boys, all signalling that they were ready. "Am I really ready?" he asked himself, scared of what unknown magic the goblins might be capable of, or if one of the goblins escaped and ordered the dozens of other boys in the camp to attack them. "We must get this right." He bent his arm and then punched the air, then did it again. On the 3rd movement, all 6 boys quickly slipped into the tents, 2 into each, ready to grab a sleeping goblin. They were prepared with cut bits of blanket ready to stuff into the goblins' tiny mouths, and lengths of rope raided from the camp stores ready to tie up the oppressive beings. It was dark in the tent, and it was difficult to find the balance between needing to be quick and trying to be careful. There were 2 small, untidy beds in the tent. In the darkness, it was impossible to tell which bed the goblin was in. Charlie had recognized it too, and they made the only move they could. They leapt at one bed each. The blankets of the bed that Duncan had thrown himself on began to fight back, and Duncan knew that he had chosen the bed with the goblin in. There were squeaky grunts coming out, baffled by the blanket. Duncan kept the writhing mass of material pinned while exploring with one hand, trying to identify exactly where the goblin was. When he felt his wrist get bitten, he suddenly knew which end the goblin's head was at, and he managed to clamp his hand over the goblin's mouth without getting bitten again. By then Charlie had arrived in support, and Duncan whispered to him to get his rag ready to stuff into the goblin's mouth. When Charlie was ready, Duncan pulled the blanket away, revealing the panicked goblin, who hadn't breathed for over half a minute because of Duncan's hand pressed over his face. Duncan counted Charlie in. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. On the sharply whispered 3, Duncan lifted his hand. The goblin took in a big relieved breath just as Charlie stuffed the piece of blanket into his mouth and then placed his hand over it to keep it in. Charlie used the other hand to pin the goblin while Duncan got his rope out and began tying the goblin up. "Ah! Quick! Get him!" Duncan heard someone call out in a harsh whisper. It sounded like Finn, calling out in a fearful tone. Duncan pulled the final knot tight on the goblin he was tying, and, with a word to Charlie to keep the goblin pinned, Duncan rushed out of the tent to investigate. He found Finn and Sam chasing a one-armed goblin that was gagged and had his single arm tied at his side, but his legs were free and he was leaping and running around Finn and through Sam's legs. All the while he was trying to use his shoulder to push the rope from his mouth. Duncan heard other voices approaching. Several boys had woken and were investigating the commotion. If they saw the tied-up goblin, or if he managed to give them an order, things would get very, very difficult for Duncan and his friends. "What's going on?" asked the closest boy. Thinking desperately, Duncan had an idea and shouted back, The goblins have ordered us to run a drill. Everyone to the walls. Prepare for an attack. Battle stations. Those magical words, the goblins have ordered, was all it took. All of the boys were instantly running in the other direction, dashing to the walls to follow the order they believed came from a goblin. Finn was chasing the rogue goblin towards Duncan, who drew his sword. Feeling the weight of the sword in his hand, he felt sure that anything he could do with it would be too slow to bother the sprightly goblin. He wished it was a net instead. With that thought, his ring flared with energy, and the sword became floppy and stretchy like rubber. Then it split itself into threads, opening into a net of fine metal wire. Duncan was feeling so amazed at what he had done, with the help of his ring, that he almost forgot to throw the net as the goblin skipped past. Just in time, Duncan flung his net and the goblin tumbled to the ground, with Finn quickly diving on top of the creature. Sam was also there in an instant, to complete the job of tying up the one-armed goblin. Sam was breathing heavily, out of breath from chasing the sprightly goblin around, but he managed to whisper to Duncan, "It was amazing how you made that net. Did you do that with your ring?" Duncan could only nod dumbly, still astonished himself. After a few more breaths, Sam added, "That was good thinking, sending all of the boys to the wall. I'm going to do a quick walk around the camp, to make sure all the boys stay away from the tents. You make sure the goblins are all secure." Duncan nodded and watched Sam wander off into the darkness. After a quick check that all 3 goblins were securely gagged and tied, and that there were no boys in sight, Duncan carried 2 of the goblins into the tent of the 3rd, and left Charlie, Finn and the other 2 boys guarding them. Charlie waited outside the tent in case any boys still under goblin influence approached, ready to tell anyone coming close that the goblins had ordered them all to man the walls. Duncan left to find Sam. Sam was at the walls, joining in with the imaginary drill in which the boys of the camp were patrolling the walls, warily watching for attack. Since they believed it to be an order from a goblin, they had no choice but to take it very seriously. Duncan didn't know what would happen if the boys began to suspect that the goblins had been attacked and tied up, so he felt that he had to break them all free of the magic prisons in which their minds were held as quickly as possible. But when he began freeing them, those still under the magical influence might still get suspicious. He also wanted to keep the boys away from the tied goblins in case anything went wrong. A possible solution came to him. First, he needed to get them all together and away from the tent that held the goblins. He walked along the wall, telling everyone that he had new orders from the goblins, that they were all to assemble outside the camp, in front of the main gate. As before, since they believed the order originated with a goblin, they were magically obliged to obey, and all those that heard him rushed to the main gate and out through it. Sam followed them, and soon they were all there, all 29 of them, plus Sam in their midst. Sam was going along with it, all without a question, trusting Duncan, for which he was grateful. With them all assembled, he described one final order that informed them came from a goblin. "You are to each shake my hand, in greeting, on the way back into the camp. You're to shake my hand until I let go. Then," he paused, allowing himself a smile, "you are to act in a foolish manner, as if freed from all goblin magic." Duncan saw a mirroring smile appear on Sam's face, as he understood what Duncan was doing. Those still under the influence of magic would see exactly what they were expecting to see, until they were all freed by Duncan.